another service on our Sabbath with After His Heart Ministries. I am Rabbi Q, and I have a question. How many of you understand that your mind actually doesn't operate off of direct information? Well, that is going to be what we are going to discuss today. And yes, again, we are going to be discussing rest. As we get into this, though, I think there's a number of things that we need to unpack. So the first one would be kind of how the mind operates. And I think that's a good place to start. And then we also need to talk a little bit about how the Shabbat or the rest is actually a huge action that occurs, and how it is actually training for something more. And I'll explain that as well. But generally speaking, when we think of the Sabbath, we think of actually not doing work, right? We may, if we are still really steeped into our Christianese, may believe that we need to go sit in a pew on Saturday morning and actually be in church instead of in church on Sunday. In fact, Seventh-day Adventists are having church on Saturday. But is the traditional service actually what is supposed to be going on? And what is the purpose behind that rest when it comes to subtleness? When we're dealing with the esoteric, the mystical, and the occult, one of the things that we will encounter is this mention of something called the subtle body. And that is going to play a role in all this as well. And I will share with you that my understanding about this is still very unknown. In other words, it's a new subject that I'm learning to understand, but it seems to be stashed in Christianity, just gently in the charismatic circles, where there is a minor learning that has occurred in the past that if you missed it, you probably won't ever get it. And if you got it, you still don't understand it until it really starts to assert itself upon your life. And it's interesting because when we think of subtle and assertive, those two don't seem to go together, because our version of assertiveness is usually actually healthy aggression, we'll call it. Okay. So where do we start? How do we unpack subtleness? The first thing that we need to do is I need to give you you can turn off the video right now and you won't have to watch it type of thing. So that would be this simple answer to that question. What is subtleness? Subtleness is actually very, very, very low frequencies that cannot be heard, that are still octaves of the higher vibrational frequencies, and therefore are only heard by those who are willing to actually take the time to slow down and pay attention. For example, did you guys know that there are actually subliminal messages built into commercials that flash at such a split second of time that you actually never know that they're there? And it would take a very special kind of equipment to actually get into the advertisements and see the subtle words that are being planted in the video commercials that you're watching. From around the time of the 1950s, they started producing commercials, and while they were producing commercials, in the beginning, they were using what was known about psychology at that time. The CIA had not begun their MK Ultra studies. They were still kind of working on some of the other the other subtle studies that they were looking at. But once they got into MK Ultra and they started realizing that the enemy, whoever that was at that time, was actually using subtle insertions of subliminal messages into common TV propaganda to convince their people right? And I think the biggest one is going to be the communist regimes around the world utilize it. In fact, I think it was actually I think it was Stalin who actually came up with the idea to first start doing it by inserting them into radio, where basically right in the middle of music there'll be a whisper and it will be a propaganda. It will be some sort of thing to where people are listening to this pleasant music and their minds are adjusted to receive it and have an open mind to it. And really inside of it is some sinister message. Well, there's a reason why that works, and there's a reason why that is so powerful, is because our subconscious mind doesn't miss a thing, and it speaks in symbols and metaphors and allegories, not in common, practical, active speech. Subtleties of dark psychology and subtleties of manipulation are actually so much more effective and efficient in controlling a person than it would ever be in trying to actually influence them with active influence. Now, there's a few reasons why this is important, but what you need to know is that what they have discovered is nothing new under the sun. And second, what they have discovered is actually part of Yahweh's design. You see, the intention behind creation was one of harmony and flow and connection. And behind all of that is this huge vibrational machine. And I'm going to explain some of that some more in a minute. So as we're unpacking, there's a couple things that we need to look at, and that is that basically how the brain processes subtleties, okay? Then what we need to realize is if we could become intentional in receiving those subtleties, then we would actually be adjusting the one part of our brain that has a problem into the flow, okay? So first and foremost, one of the things that we would get into invariably, obviously, is the Fibonacci sequence and the golden ratio. And one of the reasons for that is because, as I've shown you before, which we're going to recap here in a minute, there is a frequency behind that system, and there is a consistency behind that system. Whether we are talking about the human body and its ratio breakup, like how much is 1 and how much is 1.6 in length, and how that's our body, that's our head to torso, it's our head to our legs, our head to our feet, etc., we get into how a tree, how a flower, how a tomato grows. At what angle does every single last plant actually point its shoots, etc. Now, I know that there are exceptions because we're dealing with a fluid system. Let me illustrate for you the concept here. Let's say that our entire reality was based upon a rubber hose, okay? Now, a rubber hose has an ability to stretch or expand a little bit, okay? Now let's deal with a steel pipe. So the premise is that no matter how much water pressure is passing through a steel pipe, it actually is inflexible, which means you can't redirect a steel pipe. Let's take it a step further and let's get into concrete. Once concrete is poured, it's very permanent. So if you pour a concrete culvert, you can't come back later on and take and unscrew a section and put an elbow in and change the direction of the water. You would actually have to break up the concrete and then you would have to re-pour that culvert, right? So if you want to turn a corner, you're going to come in there with a jackhammer and with a backhoe and with a couple of dudes, and you're going to bust that stuff up, remove it, reset the forms, turn the corner with the form, and re-pour. Well, that's not true of metal piping, right? So when we're talking about fluid, one of the things I want you to think about is the ability to move around and change direction, okay? So there's a couple things that are important about that. What if we had a culvert running straight down a field and there were no gates to feed the water to that field. And somebody actually misdesigned the culvert, right? And so the idea is that the water is actually flowing in the wrong direction. But what's interesting is all the field itself is actually blocked by that culvert. The water that is so close to the field is just behind that concrete barrier. Okay. And so the ability to take a steel pipe and just turn with an elbow and head the other direction and let that water flow is obviously a little bit more flexible. Well, I want you to think that 90%, I'm sorry, 80% of humanity is probably these steel pipes. Okay. The water flows, sure, we can get with that, right? But in order for there to actually be a change, there has to be a shutting off of the water and a connection of redirecting. Now, 10% of the population are actually the concrete culverts. Okay. And the way that I want you to think about this is those concrete culverts are pre-planned and there is no changing their process. The only way to actually alter that behavior is to break it, destroy it, and rebuild it. Now all of a sudden we have the rubber hose. The rubber hose can actually be taken and redirected without a whole lot of effort. Those are the other 10% of the population who I would like to call the masters, or those who have achieved self-mastery and those who have achieved self-actualization. Now, what's interesting about all three of these is the subtlety of the fact that when you have a field right in front of this culvert with no gates on it, the water is right there. The water is right there in front of that field that needs that water, and literally it's just being refused to be given to it. Now, I know that that sounds a little bit off, but the way that I want you to think about it is that 10% of the population is so unhealthy that they have zero integration with the rest of humanity. Then we have the ones that are willing to make an adjustment, but it's still pretty permanent. You can't move it around. And the more you move it around, the more you stand the possibility of messing up the system further up. And what I mean by that is that's going to mess with water pressure, et cetera, but it's also going to mess with the possibility of breaking a joint somewhere further up the line. In fact, every time that you replace a system of pipes, there's the potential for messing up the pipes further up the line. Whereas with the rubber hose or with the plastic hoses, there is actually flexibility to kind of move in the direction of the need, right? So this sounds kind of crazy, but in a weird sort of way, the necessity to be able to be flexible is a part of this dynamic. Now, the reason I told you all that is because I want you to understand when I say that the tree grows at 137.5 degrees, the branch comes up like this at an open angle of 137.5 degrees, right? Or a closed angle of 42.5 degrees. That is basically the difference between this and this, right? Some tree branches you'll see go straight out. Does that ruin my system? Does that defact my claims? No. It's a flexible system. It's a rubber hose. Because unlike humanity, the rest of creation is actually extremely and unconditionally obedient to the system. Now, there's a few reasons why this is important, but the biggest reason is because when we talk about the subtleness of change or the subtleness of information, we miss so much. Failing to see the bigger picture is because you actually don't have a vision of the bigger picture. So here's the crazy part about it. Does the bigger picture exist? Absolutely, it does. Just because you don't believe it does doesn't mean it doesn't exist. In fact, it will assert itself upon you, and you will go ahead and put your bias towards it. An anomaly will occur in your life that messes with your belief system, and you will dismiss it and insert it somehow into the explanations. They find evidence of the flood, and immediately there's some sort of an attempt to debunk that claim by explaining some sort of scientific process that's occurring. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but the short version is that one way or another, we have got geologic proof of something breaking up the ancient land masses, something that cannot be denied, and yet at the same time is denied or claimed to have some other anomaly having occurred with it. Now, I will say this. When we finally match the Bible to science and magic, and they all come together in one equal piece, we will no longer be the concrete culvert. We will no longer be the inflexible being that just can't get our minds wrapped around the idea of a mythos and a logos. We will be the beings that actually implement magic, use of energy and intention and power into scientific experiments and bring the truth of Torah into a scientific experiment. Oh, what a powerful day that's going to be. But unfortunately, I think what's going to happen is those malevolent entities who already are in existence and have an expectation of their insatiable desire to steal the light will create a dark form of that system. A combination of magic, a combination of science, and a combination of anti-Torah. Okay, so now there are people who go, oh, well, why do we need Torah in there? Because it is actually the foundation of all that was created. Let me give you an example. When it says in Torah, and God said, let there be light, and that was the evening and the morning of the first day, you need to know that when he said, let there be light, that was Torah coming out of his mouth. How do we know? Because now it's written down. Understand? Now there's more subtleties to that, which you as a current person will probably not be able to handle, where there are nuances and subliminal messages within the Torah itself. So when you hear it in the original Hebrew, which is the proper language in which Torah was created, in which the world was created, you say, oh no, what language did God speak? Well, I can tell you what language he spoke to the people who he chose. And I can tell you what it's not. It's not the Aramaic pronunciations and the Aramaic lettering that we use today for Hebrew. But I can tell you the ancient Hebrew lifestyle language, the pictographic language in which we spoke in symbols and we did not speak in ideographs. An ideograph is where the letter the character becomes a sound, and then connecting sounds together makes words. Okay. And so one of the things that I want you to think about when we're thinking about an ideograph is that it doesn't have the power of the meaning behind it, right? That's the concept. Is that you cannot you no longer have you no longer have the allegory or the metaphor behind the letter, and that's where it starts to kind of transition into that. And then we get into actual lettering, where the letter just represents a phonic and no longer has a story behind it, We are a story-based people. I don't know if you notice this, but when you get on when you're scrolling, right? When you're scrolling or you're watching YouTube like you are right now, what are we looking for? We're looking for the story that we can relate to. In fact, one of the most powerful search engine optimization techniques is to actually get the story into a small enough phrase that it actually ends up in the search engine, because a majority of the time what people are doing when they're searching is they're looking for the story behind the thing. Why did Abraham Lincoln do this? Or where did Abraham Lincoln live? Right? And so now a story is given to you. The answer to your question is usually a story. Stories are basically recountings of historical events that you can relate to. In fact, I will tell you, when I was a kid, um, we were up in Aspen. We were driving up there on a Saturday, which was awkward to me because Saturdays were reserved for other things. We were Jehovah's Witnesses, and Saturdays were reserved for other things. And I asked my dad, I said, "What are we doing? Where are we going?" And he says, "We're going to go see a storyteller." Okay. And so when we got up there, and of course this was like just a thing for kids, and we got up there and we went to this, I think it was what would have been considered the middle school up there at the time. I think it's completely demolished now. And we go into this auditorium and we sit down, and or no, actually it was the library. That's right. So we go into the library, we sit down, and this man starts telling these amazing stories about things. And some of them were kind of ridiculous. Like there was this one where this guy basically perceived that there was something crawling in his bed and it kept wiggling at the end of his bed. And so he gets out his gun and shoots it. And of course, it was his toe, right? So they were kind of ridiculous stories. But the thing was, is that I could not comprehend why the man was called a storyteller and how was that relevant to reality. Like he's not a maintenance man like my dad. He's not a cleaner like my mom. He's not a teacher like the people at school. What's a storyteller and how does he make any money? Right? And so I really couldn't understand. But what was crazy is how mesmerized I remember being. Like I almost couldn't leave it alone. There was a part of me that just thought they were really lame, right? And so I wanted to leave, but the truth is I wanted to hear the end of the story. And truth be told is if I had said something like, "Oh, I remember this," and got about halfway through and then changed the subject, your mind would be so messed up for the rest of the day and you wouldn't know why. Because our minds are emotionally attached to unfinished things. And so when I say that there is a story, right? What I'm saying is that when letters had meaning, they spoke to the subconscious or to the subtle, right? Okay. Now, what does that mean for us in reality? That means that in order for us to benefit from anything that's subtle, we have to change our way of operating. Okay? So there's a number of ways that we could illustrate this, but since I illustrated the culvert and the metal pipe and the hose, let's go ahead and illustrate some containers. Okay? So the first container that we have is going to be a huge concrete cistern. Okay, so the water comes down the concrete pipe, I'm sorry, the concrete culvert, and connects to the concrete cistern and begins filling with water, right? Now, what do we know about this? The first one is that once it's full, and it cannot get any bigger, nor can it get any smaller, right? The next thing we know is that once it's there, it's there. There's really no way to empty that thing without going and getting a bucket and emptying it, or what? Another conduit of some sort being connected to it so it can flow. Okay, so that's one important thing. Here's another interesting and important thing. It cannot push water back up the line. Okay, So now the next part is going to be a pipe connected to an air tank. Okay. So the whole idea is that an air tank is designed to experience a subtotal amount of contraction or expansion when the air is pressed into it, and therefore the metal itself actually pushes outward, which makes the air compressed. Okay, so you can pump air into a metal canister, and not only will the air have pressure when it's coming out of it, it will have more pressure than the air that was pushed into it. You can take 10 psi, push it into an air tank, and as long as that air tank will expand to receive the 10 psi, it will get bigger and bigger and bigger up to like maybe 100, maybe 200, 300 psi or pounds per square inch. And when you open that valve, it's not coming out at 10. Okay? You need to regulate it in order to prevent it from destroying whatever tool you're trying to use. Okay, so that is that one. Now what we have is a rubber hose connected to a rubber container that would receive air or water. Okay, so there's two really interesting things here. The first one is that as something is receiving, it is expanding, right? It's expanding, it's getting bigger. But what's the interesting thing about it? It actually can be pushed upon, like your bladder, can be pushed upon, and it will flow right back out the system. And you can actually use the same hose located in a different position to discharge whatever's in there. So if it's air in a balloon, you can open a different valve and let that air flow out of that balloon, etc. Another thing that's interesting is that there's no minimum capacity for pressure. And what I mean by that is that an air compressor requires you to put a certain amount of air into the tank before it really becomes compressed and can pressurize down a line. Whereas if you have an expandable container, you can put a minimum amount in and still have pressure to push something down the line. Now, why do I bring this up? Because we're getting back into the subtle here. So the idea is that within the air compressor tank, you have a subtle amount of air going into the compressor with a valve preventing it from flowing back down or back out, okay? So the premise is that as long as that valve holds that pressure, you can push more and more and more and more in, and it will become more and more pressurized because it's expanding a little bit. That's 80% of humanity. 80% of humanity can handle a little pressure, can expand a little bit, and is able to discharge a lot of energy through what? Through an emotional outburst, through a punch of energy to win the race, a punch of energy to get up that last bit of the hill, etc. Right? Then we have the 10% who just has the culvert that just fills with stuff, and once it's full, and who cares, because the only way you're going to empty it is to go over there with a bucket, right? And then we have the 10% of humanity that is able to adapt to the amount of pressure and can return that pressure back upon the system and can expand if necessary to receive more pressure and can discharge in a regulated way right back down the system. Which means what? Which means you can turn around and use energy that is sent towards you, convert it, transmute it, and send it back out in the same system that it received it in the first place. The idea behind a language having a story behind its letters is based upon that concept that the subconscious mind actually what? Is adjusting to the symbols, the vibrational sounds, the spells that we speak are not as powerful as the symbols that we draw. And the reason for that is because the part of the mind that actually controls the body, the part of the mind that keeps you breathing or having your heart beat at a certain speed, or having cells do what they're supposed to do, has nothing to do with your conscious choice. Right now, you can't make the choice. Now, you could hold your breath. That's a real thing. But really, can you control your breathing to the extent that you could actually tell your body, don't breathe anymore? No. All the incongruities and all of the discomfort and all the pain points involved in holding your breath or controlling your breath have something to do with a conscious choice to do that, as opposed to the fact that as I'm speaking, I'm breathing and I'm not making a choice to take a breath. So we have some subtle controls here and there, but truth be told is that a regulation of a heartbeat, the regulation of homeostasis within your body is out of your control when it comes to its willingness to do what it is created to do. Well, the same is true of the tree that's growing. The tree that's growing and having its angle and doing all of its things with the Fibonacci, right? Growing in the form of the spiral and all of the other things that are involved in the Golem ratio and all the stuff that I don't need to get into today because we've already discussed it in the cycles teaching. We need to understand is a flow, is an intention from creation and an obedience that we don't completely understand that has to do with a subtleness. Now, the reason I bring this up is because there's an element of necessity to identify that if there's a subtleness in nature, that if there's this subtle obedience to things, then there needs to be an understanding that we are actually above that creation. We are actually in authority to that creation. We are actually in a state of being in which that whole creation actually conspires on your behalf personally to what? To be obedient to the instruction to have Adam and his sons be in absolute dominion to it. Whether you believe that or not is totally irrelevant. And you know what? You can try to disprove me all you want, but truth be told is it doesn't care. The system does not have any empathy for your lack of ability to conform to it. It is going to continue to operate, whether you like it or not. Now, one of the reasons why that's so important is because when we start to get into the language of creation, Hebrew, we don't have phonics. Let me repeat that. When you get into the language of creation, you do not have phonics. You do not vibrate creation into existence. Now, I know that's difficult to believe because we are kind of stuck in a Hertzian world. But what you need to understand is when something is made out of nothing, the reason behind the something being made out of nothing has nothing to do with the system itself. The system itself is the operation behind the thing that was created. So what's interesting about that is you don't believe in the system, but you were created. And here's the interesting thing about that is you were created out of nothing. And if you're created out of nothing, that means that that original thing that you were created out of actually is something that you don't understand. Yet the system itself is something you can understand and has been tried to be communicated to us over time. The Hebrew language is so subtle in its meanings once we got into the phonic of the letters, we don't realize that the meaning of the word has nothing to do with the sounding of the word. We're all trying to figure out how to pronounce Yahweh, right? We got Nehemiah Gordon, who is absolutely adamant, went to the Catholic archives, went down in the basement where everybody's forbidden to go, and sees Jehovah mentioned, and is absolutely convinced that that is the way to pronounce it. And then we got this guy over here saying, oh no, this is actually how you pronounce it, Yahweh, right? And then there are people that are like, oh no, it's actually Yahuwah, right? And et cetera, et cetera. Now here's the big pieces of this whole puzzle. It was never about the vibration that you speak. It was about the meaning behind the letters. It was about the story that the letters told. When I say that the ancient Hebrew nomadic lifestyle was created by Abraham and that the ancient Hebrew nomadic lifestyle is actually adapted as a result of the communication between Abraham and Yahweh, then you would understand that Yahweh actually created the ancient Hebrew nomadic lifestyle contrary to the lifestyle of the nations. An antithesis of humans' best thinking. And a couple things that I want you to think about when we get into that thought process. The first one is that you want to have some sort of illustration of history. So what I mean by that is that basically, how do we know that it was the antithesis of the nations? Well, we have anthropology, archaeology, and historical documentation of what the human beings were doing at the time of Abraham worldwide. Whether we go into the time of the South American humans, right, who were living in the time of Abraham and see what they were practicing on their towers of Babel, right? Or we look to the Middle East and we look at those towers of Babel, or we look to Asia and look at those towers of Babel, we find the same truth that they were involved in human sacrifice, exploitation of women, exploitation of children, chattel slavery, cruelty to animals, oppression of the poor, oppression of the needy, etc. Those are all things that were contrary to Yahweh's influence upon Abraham's life. But how was that communicated? Did Yahweh just say, look, Abraham, if you want to actually serve me, since you're interested in who's actually in charge here, here's what you shouldn't do? No, Abraham had already concluded through his compassion that you should not be cutting a man's heart out while he's still alive. That's mean, right? And so then when he realized that there was really nobody governing this senseless violence that was going on, he cries out and says, who's in charge of this mess? Yahweh responds, I am. And so then Abraham's like, well, can we talk? Because this is messed up, man. And so begins the relationship between God and Abraham. To the extent that whatever the conversation was between God and Abraham, he goes back to his father's shop and smashes all the idols in his father's shop. And so then his father comes in and says, hey, what did you do? And he goes, I didn't do it. That thing did it. Because why? He had put the hammer in the hands of the biggest idol that he had smashed. In other words, he did it. That guy did it. And of course, his father's like, this kid is messed up. We gotta do something about it. And I'm not going to tell you that whole story. But my point that I'm trying to make is the ancient Hebrew nomadic pictographic language is based upon a philosophy that was established in such a way as to explain the actual goings on and happenings of the world in the universe at that time. And the secrets of the universe are contained within the letters. Not the letters that are basically the Aramaic adaptation of the Hebrew language because of the Babylonian exile, or the Aramaic phonics of the language that are part of the Hebrew language because of the Babylonian exile, and which is one of the reasons why, our church forefathers believed that Jesus spoke Aramaic and not Hebrew, which consequently is also an anti-Semitic subtlety, but that's another story, is because what was Hebrew has changed. Now, when you get into this, the actual nuances of language evolution, you'll find that Akkadian versus Sumerian is where we start to get into the actual phonic pronunciation of ancient Semitic. We find that Sumerian is where we actually get into the pictographic indication of ancient Semitic, but the premise is all the same. The letters tell a story, and stories have symbols in them, metaphors, which means what? The ancient Hebrew spoke to the subconscious, not the conscious. So the question is what then is the purpose of the conscious mind? What is the concept behind the conscious mind? Well, it's a response to the now, right? That's the biggest thing, is it's a response to the now. Whereas the subtleties of subliminal messaging, for example, things from like MK Ultra or other things like, for example, what the Monroe Institute does with their tapes when you listen to them in your ears, and the changes that actually occur in your psyche and in your entire fabric of reality are all subtle messaging. Now, we know this to be true because one of the things that we still have in our lives to this day are times where we go into trances in order for certain things to happen. For example, you can sit down at a table and you could say Baruch haba, or I'm sorry, you could say Baruch Adonai, right? And put your blessing behind it, right? For example, blessed are you, Lord God, King of the universe, who gives us bread from the earth, right? Which is a blessing just for bread. There is no way on God's green earth that right before you are about to trigger your pleasure center of dopamine in the satisfaction of hunger, that your primary concern is to kavanah your prayer. Now, kavanah is basically an intentional and powerful meditational prayer. And so people do not go and sit down at a table and drop into kavanah in order to pray or bless their food, right? In fact, understanding barachos or blessings, you will see and understand that it is not a trance-based action. It's an intention, and it is a statement and a vibration of information coming out of your mouth in your conscious state. But when you have your head covered and you're davening, you are actually accessing the parasympathetic system. You are releasing your body and your mind and your reality from the sympathetic system, the fight or flight system, which means what? You're making yourself vulnerable, yes, of course, but also you're dropping it into a trance 1 or 2, and that trance 1 or 2, possibly 3, depending on how good you are at it, is actually getting into the subtle mind. Okay? And so when there is now information that could be coming in, you can actually hear it. Now, when they're davening and they're repeating prayers and all of that, there's a repetition to it. What is the point behind that? Do you know that they do this as well while they're studying Torah? While they're meditating upon Torah, they're tactilely repeating this right here. Why? What is the point behind this? What is the point behind putting rabbi's oil upon your beard while you are studying Torah and meditating upon it? It has to do with the idea of causing your conscious mind. So when your conscious mind experiences repetition, it gets bored. And what it'll do is it'll drop out, and the repetition will actually go straight into the subconscious. And so the idea behind this, the idea behind davening, has nothing to do with some weird bowing or some other stuff that anti-Semites try to say is witchcraft. It actually has to do with a saying to your conscious mind, excuse me, sir, I don't need you right now. Get out of here. Saying to your conscious mind, hey, I have information for you. Here it comes. And so the conscious mind's like, okay, yep, I'm gonna go over here and play on the carousel. And it's just gonna go round and round, and now you don't even know what's going on. And while that's happening, you are introducing subtle sounds and words and vibrations into your soul that is Torah. And as you're introducing those into your soul, you are actually experiencing a story, an allegory, a metaphorical, symbolic language that the conscious mind cannot understand when it's reading Torah. Now, that does not work in the English because the nuances of the letters themselves have the meaning behind the word. For example, the Hebrew word tomei. Okay, let's put it up on the board really quick here. So the Hebrew word tomei is actually made up of a tav, right? A mem, and a aleph. Tomei. Okay. Now, if we look, this is obviously a child root. Let's prove that real quick. What do we know? We know that the name of Yahweh is Yod, He, Vav, He, right? And we know the name of the vessel is Elohim, right? Now, what's important is that the Aleph itself is actually representative of the entire word Elohim. Now, I'm not going to explain to you why that is. I'm just going to tell you that that is true, and you can fact check me. But the premise is that Yahweh Elohim, or a strengthening through a doubling of the last letter, makes this a child and not an adoption. So let's take a look at this really quick. From that perspective, then, we have an extra hey right here. And so by default, we can go ahead and we can get rid of this one. Now, there are rabbis rolling over in their grave because I just wrote the name of God and I'm erasing it. And then we can get rid of these, okay? And so what we have is the yod, the hey, the vav, or a doubled last letter. And whatever letter is, I have no idea. But let's just go ahead and fix that real quick so you don't write that down and copy that mistake. Okay, so basically we have a doubled last letter. Okay, now from that perspective then, what can we do here? Right off the bat, we can come along and we can take our red line and cross it through the aleph. Meaning what? All that's left here. And by the way, this is the word. Let's write this in this color here. This is the word for let's make that U a little better. Unclean. Okay? Unclean is the word tomei. Now, in English, unclean has two pieces to it. It has the which is what? A negation particle. It is negating whatever comes next. And clean has plenty of meanings, but short version is we could say not dirty, we could say not soiled, we could say not defiled, right? So unclean means you are defiled or you are dirty, right? Okay. So in principle, this does not communicate a story. Okay? But now watch this. Now we have, oh, you know what? I spelled tomei wrong. Very bad. Okay, let me fix that. Let me go ahead and fix it. This is actually supposed to be a tet. Okay. All right. So we have this idea of unclean. So what is this? Well, let's take a look here. So first of all, what we have is we have the ancient Hebrew pictograph of a container or basket. Now I could illustrate this a little bit better by doing this. That's like the top-down view of a basket. Furthermore, a lot of times they would make the handles crisscross so that you could effectively hold it with two hands. So you put a hand here and a hand here, or some other way of holding it. But also the principle is that the baskets were flexible containers. They were not static. And so when you put pressure here, you need it to put pressure on all these parts so that it doesn't dump over. So it's a very practical reason why there's an X in the middle of a circle, right? But that's not anything we necessarily need to concern ourselves with. The thing we need to concern ourselves with is the principle that it is actually a basket or container, right? So what is the mem? The mem is actually water, right? And so if we had water kind of flowing along, right, and making waves and being subtle, then that's kind of what we've got going on with water, right? So that's why the mem, or that water right there, is a representation. So what is this? It's a container of water. Now, where does this come from? Where does the container of water come from? It comes from the metaphorical concept or the subconscious interpretation of a conscious reality, which was when you come in from the field, you are dirty. So there is a pot of water waiting for you at the opening to your tent. And when you get there, you reach down and you mikvah. You wash your hands. Why? Because you have whatever grime from the field or the animals upon it, and you do not bring that into the tent. You don't bring the stink, you don't bring the yuck into the tent. Furthermore, you remove your sandals and wash your feet. Symbolic of what? You don't bring that into your tent. You don't bring filth or nastiness into your tent. So when Joshua says the words, as for me and my bayit, as for me and my tent, we will serve the Lord. He's saying, as for me and my family, but he refers to the tent because within the tent is provision, protection, and instruction. And you are not going to bring the exposure, nakedness, and dryness into the tent. In fact, the first thing you do is convert that dryness into moisture upon your hands, upon your feet. So there is a huge story behind the word unclean in the Hebrew language system. The word unclean itself, in the English, you cannot get that nuance and you will never get that vibration. If I say unclean, it has a whole nother vibrational frequency and spell behind it that you may or may not understand. But when I say tomeh, I am creating the vibrations of the information needed to explain the actual story behind the truth of the word unclean, which is what? A solution to being unclean. The mikvah, or what your Christians like to call baptism. Okay, so the reason why that is so important to understand is because when we are dealing with the ancient Hebrew language alphabet, and culture and lifestyle, we are dealing with a very different animal than the reality that we're working with right now. Because why? They knew that there was a subtlety to intuition, a subtlety to information being retained into their subconscious. Now, we know that Freud and Jung were kind of the ones who became masters of the information of the conscious versus the unconscious. The ego, the superego, the id, all those things are just nothing new under the sun. Solomon knew them in some form of information, but the short version is that there's a part of your life that is out of your control, that interprets symbols a certain way, interprets subtleties a certain way, that dark psychologists have become masters of, and then went and got hired at corporations and manipulated your mind. If you want proof, I will show you. There are poisons now in our food designed around a false narrative of nutrition. Let me explain. There is a belief within the system of health that there is a problem with regular sucrose or sugar, okay? And that there's a problem that causes people to become obese, okay? And that information has been communicated in a narrative by somebody who actually would know exactly how to do it as a result of who they were. Let me explain. For the sake of just letting things lie how they're going to lie, I'm not going to say the name of the person, but I'm going to tell you right now that the person behind all of the unnatural sugars and the person behind the propagation of it being an answer to the sugar problem was the director of the CIA. His companies actually propagated saccharin in things like Splenda, sucralose, maltodextrin, which was supposed to be a weight loss drug, right? And is now in foods. What's my point? They're all poisonous. They're all poisonous, and they're designed to subtly manipulate you to believe that you are actually doing something healthy for your body so that you will what? Consume this chemical and make this person money through a subtle process. A subtle process that says, when it says diet, you think health. And so you go consume a diet soda with aspartame in it. And did you know that aspartame, when it is raised to a certain temperature, becomes extremely toxic to the body? Guess what that temperature is? 98.6. Would beg the question, why are you propagating, selling, and making money off of something that becomes extremely toxic to the body at the temperature of a human being? Director of the CIA. And so one of the things that you need to get your mind wrapped around is that they have mastered this already. The workers of darkness, or at least those who do not have compassion upon your life to give you health, to give you well-being, and to lead your body into a true state of spiritual mastery, are actually mastering things that your ancestors knew as a natural process. Proof is the subtlety of the stories behind the Hebrew language. Why did the ancient Hebrews, watch this, I'm going to show you just another kind of recap here. Why did the ancient Hebrews come along? And so now in the English, this is what we have. In the English, we have the word light, which we perceive as some light emitting, some photon emitting source, right? Light. And then we perceive the concept of seeing as that being what? An interpretation of light by rods and cones, right? Okay, now bear with me. Now, when we see let there be light in the English in Genesis, we think what? Photon emission, right? We don't perceive the word light as any other thing except photon emission. And then what we do is we see the word see, right? And we perceive that it has something to do with the rods and cones in our eyes perceiving light in a certain way. However, the ancient Hebrews, in their subtleness and in their understanding that we have yet to completely grasp, instead take and they draw the pictographs Aleph, Vav, Resh. Aleph, Vav, Resh. And then they come along and, oh, wait a minute. I'm lying to you. This isn't the ancient pictographs, is it? No, it is not. In fact, truth be told, not only is this not the ancient pictographs, but this is not even ancient Hebrew. What I'm trying to tell you is that these letters right here come from Babylon. They do not tell the story, which means what? The rabbis are in error too, right? We're not just going to throw Christians under the bus here. We're going to throw everybody under the bus. And why and how? What's the point behind it? Well, let me show you. This is an Aleph, the lead ox, right? Representing what? Strength, right? And then this is what? This is the Resh, right? And this is no relation to anybody you know, but that's the Resh. And what do we have here? We have head, or better yet, mind, or man. It doesn't matter which one of these you use because there's a problem. How in the world is light a strong head, or a strong mind, or a strong man? How in the world is the reverse of that? Let me show you the reverse of that. Okay, here we go. Let's see, I don't want that in the blue. I still want that in the green. So here we go. So this is the word, this is the word re'ah. Okay, and do you know what it means? It means to see. But what do we have here? We have strong head. Observer, yes, but let's just go ahead and drop that because that's a child root. So the root is this right here, meaning what? The root is head of strength. So to see is to have a head of strength. Light being a strong mind. Hello. Do you think maybe they knew something we don't? In the beginning, right? He says in verse 3 of Genesis, by the way, there were no verses. There were only breaks, and those breaks had special meanings. But let's say that we just say it as that single verse right there. Let there be light. That specific piece right there that has the break. Let there be light. Literally says there will be an observed actioning of existence of a strong mind. In the ancient pictographic Hebrew, the stories tell the observed existence of a strong mind. It does not say light there. But yet, we in the English read light and we're good. We just move on to the next thing. In fact, I can tell you one of the craziest things that happened to me was when I had this moment when the Christmas tree appears to be the problem in Jeremiah chapter 10, and the pagan practice of Ishtar seems to be tied into the prophecies in Isaiah, and all of the other things that I learned about the feast days and all the other things, I got frustrated and angry and overwhelmed and was like, wait a minute here. My entire world, my entire Christian world has been turned upside down. I can't be a Christian anymore because it's all based upon lies. And I was angry and I was on the floor blowing snot bubbles, repenting for everything that I taught about the rapture and the end times and all this other stuff. And finally, I get up off the floor and I'm like, never again. I'm not doing this anymore. I'm going to go find another God to worship because you are definitely not God. Because if this is all true and this is this, and I was mad. I searched the world for something that could meet the criteria of the God I wanted to worship and serve, and I could not find it. And so I thought, well, I'm going to try the Bible one more time. And I went in and I started in Genesis in the Hebrew, and I was there for 10 years. I never left Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 for 10 years. 10 years I was in chapter 1, verse 1, and people will read through the Bible in a year. And so it is very important for you to understand until you grasp the nuances of what is actually going on. This is meaningless. Do not read it in the English and think that you've been given the message. You're not even speaking the vibrations correctly. You're casting spells that you don't understand when you're saying light. And so when we are working with this process, I'm telling you, it will flip your script. But one of the things that it will flip in your script is it will flip the fact that, truth be told, everything that pertains to God, everything that pertains to theotis, right? Everything that pertains to Elohim, everything that pertains to Yahweh, everything that pertains to Yeshua is subtle. Do you know that Yeshua was a verbal ninja? For those of you who really need to understand this, go watch the movie Hero, right? With Jet Li. In that movie, basically, he is the assassin who's designed to kill the emperor. And in that movie, he comes up and learns how to make a subtle cut so powerful that it will appear as though it is a fatal wound, and it is not, so that he can demonstrate that he killed one of the emperor's enemies and brings the sword of that enemy to the emperor so that he can approach, so that he can get close enough to the enemy, or I'm sorry, to the emperor to kill him. Point being is the subtlety of the cut. In other words, the way that I want you to think about this is that Yeshua would strike with his words in such a way that would actually cut his opponent, and his opponent wouldn't even know he had been hit. Even the way he talks to you in the Gospels, in the English, is a subtle cut that you will not grasp. You will not get unless you are what? Able to be flexible, able to make adjustments, able to change the dynamic, right? Able to accept things that you actually have been taught not to accept because there is an agenda behind your religion. And so, why is this important? Because number one, you need to understand that the way that you go into your rest has nothing to do with a conscious process. Remember last week at the very end of my message, I told you that one of the things that you needed to do is to use your power of disassociation that you've been so skillful at when it comes to your fears, and actually disassociate from the reality of all of the things that you are not supposed to do on Shabbat. I have become such a master at this that there is a rare thing that will actually encroach upon my Shabbat that has anything to do with the other 6 days of the week. And what I mean by that is that there are times where, for example, a text will come in and it will pertain to business, and I will have to wait until the end of the Sabbath to address it, and it will come into my mind. So I'm again talking about flexibility here, nuances, not necessarily perfect in it, but tending towards perfection. I disassociate from all of the things that actually encroach upon my reality in the rest of the 6 days of the week. There is no other reality but Shabbat during the Shabbat. The sun will begin to set on Friday, and I will still want to be doing something with business or something with other elements, maybe something that's stressing me out or whatever. And truth be told, is as soon as that sun sets, I can't afford to be the 80% of population for a number of reasons. Number one, and this is very important, I have to get on here in the morning the next day and teach you something purely from intuition. Having encountered some question or statement or action during the week and having a confirmation that that's actually going to become the message, not knowing how to prepare it, not having bullet points. When you see me look down, I'm actually looking at my tablet and seeing myself, or looking down and seeing myself on the monitor to make sure that I'm framing myself in such a way that it's not going to turn off the mind and create an incongruity. But truth be told, beyond that, I have no idea what I'm going to say. I didn't sit down this morning drinking my coffee thinking about culverts. Okay, that came up during the message. And truth be told, is the reason for that is because I want to try to give the purest version of that. If I am biased towards my fears and biased towards all of the junk, my wounds, my entitlements, my limiting beliefs, my lack of imagination, I am going to manipulate you, and I'm going to try to convince you of what I think is right, and I'm going to try to put you in a position to where you agree with my position. When truth be told, that is not what you need. That is unfortunately what you have been given as you've been sitting in the pulpit on Sunday morning, or worse yet, on Saturday morning, or worse yet, in the synagogue davening, and don't realize that that davening is supposed to be kavana. Realizing that that davening is actually trance level 1 or 2, and possibly 3. There are a number of things that actually happen in the nuance of worship and in the nuance of prayer that are common with every single last group. You could be Hindu, you could be Buddhist, you could be you could be you could be some ancient religion like Zoroastrian. You could be and have an Arabic faith, could be Islam, could be some other Arabic faith. You could be Christian, you could be Abrahamic, so one of those, right? You could be even an atheist. And if you rock, do you know there is actually a group of Muslims who live on Khyber Pass in Afghanistan who actually pray differently than the rest of the Muslims in the whole of Islam. Instead of them bowing into the prayer position, they rock back and forth in the prayer positions. So if they're doing their sitting part of the prayer position, they're rocking. If they're doing their standing part of their prayer position, they're rocking. When they study Quran, they are actually davening. Now, we won't get into the nuances of the possibility that they're actually Hebrews and they've been taught that they're not. But we will get into the idea that that is activating the parasympathetic. Do you know when a massage therapist begins their massage session, one of the first things they do is subtly rock the patient? Now, it's taught in the massage schools that it's actually something that gets them to kind of connect with when they were rocked as a baby, which is a very comfortable and vulnerable thing, right? But truth be told is that the entire parasympathetic system actually gets activated within that rocking period. So here we are again, working with the idea that what we introduce into massage is actually a subtle process. I'm going to convince your muscles to relax themselves through a subtle insertion of information, letting them know that they're actually not relaxed, right? Beginning with what? A trance. And massage schools across the nation teach that your clients go into a trance. I often get it mixed up because a license for a massage therapist is actually a medical license. And so I don't know why they're not called patients. But anyways, having said all that, I think the important thing to realize is that whether we're dealing with the mental body, the emotional body, the spiritual body, or the physical body, whether we're dealing with any one of those bodies, we're dealing with subtleties. Okay, so now we need to get into the second part of this message. So now I think you understand now that A, phonics as a vibrational process have to be in their correct language and in their correct context. Tome, right? Tome is actually unclean, but tome is the spelling of the Hebrew word for unclean. Unclean is the spelling word for Proto-Indo-European, meaning that any spells that are cast in Proto-Indo-European have meaning behind their vibrations. Remember when I taught you about the vowels versus the stops, and how you're actually singing and how you're actually activating through intention and vibration something. And so when you speak and you say things, you are actually agreeing to a spell. And that's why we call it spelling. Now, some people would disagree with that. And if you go look in the etymological dictionary, I'm sure you'll find that spell doesn't necessarily have anything to do with lettering, right? Okay. So now we need to kind of look at something really quick that I'm going to show you. I think the way that we're going to do this is we're going to start with a circle, okay? And within that circle, let's see, I'm going to go ahead and we'll just do this in yellow. We're going to call this 0, right? We're going to call this 180 degrees. So, of course, this is 90. And this is 270. And this is also 360. Now, let's just go ahead and let's make this a little bit more realistic in the world of mathematics and get rid of the 0, because the truth is that it is actually starting at 360 degrees, but it doesn't count past 360 degrees. It starts at 0, counts 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way to 90 to get to that first vertical position. But the premise is that if we have a center, which we'll just do in a different color, we have a center here, and then we have some sort of triangle, which we'll do in a different color, and let's make this a little bit thicker. We'll do in a different color, and let's say that that triangle then now has some sort of, whoops, I did that wrong. It has some sort of connection from the center. Let me fix this real quick here. We need that center point in there. There we go. All right, so now we are in purple, good, with the pins a little bit thicker. So we have this line coming out to the edge, right? and then we have another point here. Well, that line coming out to that edge and to that other point is basically what's called the radius, or it is basically the thing that is the outside of the circle versus the center of the circle. The outside of the circle actually traces the radius around in a circle. The line that comes down from the point to the radius here, okay, is actually important as well. So if we have another radial point here, the line that's coming down, and then this point here, which I'm going to go back to my regular thickness, and we'll probably use like a red X here. This point here is really important to this whole thought process. Now, what's interesting is there's another line, and I'm going to go ahead and illustrate that here. Let's see, let's just use blue for that. There's another line that goes, okay, come on, draw straight. There we go. That line right there is very important because what's interesting is as this moves up, say to here, so as this one, that is not correct. Let's see, we're going to go with red here. As this point, I thought I changed my pin. There we go. Okay, so as this point moves to here, so this is position 1, this is position 2. As that moves to position 2, what does not change? What does not change is actually going to be the radius. The radius will stay constant. Now the vertical drop down from the radius point to the other radial point of 0 is now going to alter the name of the angle. So in this case, when we're dealing with this, what we have is we have this idea of an angle being here and then the angle being here. So let's say this is 30 degrees. Let's say that this is 60 degrees. Okay. Now we know the radius pointing straight up and down is 90 degrees. But what you don't realize is as you're watching this position 1 and position 2, if we were to look at this as something where we were looking straight on at it, or if we were kind of measuring the location of it, let me show you what I mean. And don't panic here. It doesn't matter if you know geometry or mathematics. So let's say that this is what we would call the minimum and the maximum. As in, when we're looking at this, what we see is we actually see a starting point and an end point in vertical communication, right? And so whatever this length is, which we'll just call L, is actually going to be the minimum and maximum between those 2 points. We didn't see a point down here, okay? And we don't see a point up here. We only see these 2 points. So from our perspective, L is actually the most important thing. And that measurement between that point and that point are the only thing that we actually are aware of or observe. Now, the reason why that's important is because if we were to continue to watch this whole entire thing go around in a circle, okay? So let me just kind of wake your mind up for a minute because you're scared of the mathematics right now. Go around in a circle. Oops. Go around in a circle. Go around in a circle. Go around in a circle. So what's interesting is as you watch this point go around in a circle, what's happening to it from our perspective when we think about it linearly? What's it doing? It's going up and then coming back down. And that's it. That's all it's actually doing is it goes around the circle. There's a rise and a fall, right? That's all. So this point here, and this point here have something to do with an up and down movement. Now, if we add time into that, then all of a sudden it would look like this. It would start high. Somewhere along the lines, it would go low, and then it would start high again. And if we were to actually graph that, then it would look like that. And over time, technically, it would look like this. Well, guess what? From this point here to this point here, and is what we call frequency. So the reason why I showed you this circle is because when you start at Passover in 2025, you are not on linear time. How do we know? Because as far as we know, we were given instruction that at Passover 2026, we would repeat something, right? But they fall on the same moment in time, only later in time. Meaning what? Passover is a frequency. This is what I taught in the cycles message. Now, when we're talking about frequency, let's get a new board. When we're talking about frequency, generally speaking, this is what we are talking about, the sine wave, right? So the concept here is that this is 0, this is 90, this is 180, this is 270, and this is 360. Okay, I'm sorry, that's actually off a little bit because I really should not have put that line further beyond that point. So actually what we're going to do, I'm just going to scribble this out because I don't want to erase it. Actually, I can actually erase it. Come think of it. I can get this real quick and we can redraw it. So basically we're going to go 0, 90, 180, 360. We're going to come back to 0, but what's the thing that you see here? See, in your mind, linear time is working like this, tracking along, but truth is all time is actually going like this. Okay? Let me tell you what it's not doing. It is not doing this. We have perceived it that way, but we are dead wrong. Now, the reason why this is important then is because if we start to get into an actual circle of time and start to accept that, then we can accept that this works like this. Sabbath is a oops. Actually, you know what? I'm actually not going to call it a rhythm. I'm going to call it a frequency because that's the direction we need to go with this. It is a rhythm. It is actually called a circaheptane rhythm or a 7-day rhythm, right? But I want it to be different in your mind, okay? Because the Sabbath is actually doing this over time. So this is the Sabbath. This is time. But that's actually because there is a rise and a fall, and then a rise again. See how it's falling on this side of the circle and rising on that side of the circle as we have a center point going around the circle? Meaning what? Meaning that Sabbath itself as a movement is a frequency. Now, let me explain something to you. One oscillation over 1 second is a hertz. Okay? So one oscillation over 1 second is a hertz. So now what we would have to do is we would have to figure out how many seconds are in a Sabbath cycle to understand how subtle of a frequency is actually coming through to you on the Sabbath. Through the system of your body, through the system of the spiritual, through the system of your mind. Okay? And your emotions for that matter. But the premise is that when we're working with this thought process, you need to unhook yourself from a linear timeline and realize that all of the things that pertain to Sabbath are coming around again. You don't think in your mind as a female, you don't think in your mind and say, "Oh, you know what? So actually I started my line." Do you say that? No, you say I started my cycle. Guess what? That's exactly what you need to be saying at sundown on Friday. I started my cycle. Right? Because truth be told is the moment that Shabbat hits, something changes in the entire function and mechanism of the universe, because again, it is being obedient to an instruction from the intensification of all power in the universe. Now, we have found subtle, not in everything, because we're getting back to the idea that the universe is a hose in a balloon, not a culvert in a cistern. So we have found subtle circa heptane rhythms in nature sufficient enough to write a paper and submit it to the National Institute of Health. Which consequently, if you don't know anything about the National Institute of Health, what you need to know is that papers that actually don't contain that do not have veracity are not submitted to the archives. There are plenty of people who write opinions, but it has to be backed by science. And that's the rule. In fact, I will tell you the NIH archives are probably one of your greatest repositories of information for you to understand correspondence. What do I mean by that? You can learn everything you need to learn about your God, the universe, and everything else through what is on those papers, because that which has been made, what speaks of the individual invisible attributes of the eternal power and the divine nature. Now, when we are working with the concept that the Sabbath actually has a frequency, it is imperative that you understand that you can't hear it with the human ear. You have to hear it with something different. Now, I'm just going to go with a little gentle nuance here and say that there is actually a piezoelectric structure within your body that is designed to pick up these subtle frequencies or these subtle sounds. Now, if you were to speed Sabbath up, and watch this now, this one is going to kind of blow your mind a little bit. If we were to speed Sabbath up to the amount of seconds needed to sufficiently produce 1 hertz of vibration, therefore something that you could hear, you still couldn't hear it. It's not until we get to about 20 hertz that you can actually hear. Now, add in the fact that that still isn't something you can see. You see, we have to speed it up even more. We have to get it up to about 20 million hertz before you could actually start to perceive it. But then what's interesting is once we start to get into the gigahertz, we start to actually get into the subtleties of light. Okay? Now, I might be off on my measurements a little bit, and I don't really care. Because the whole point I'm trying to make to you is that light is actually sound. But what it is it's a really, really high frequency that starts to become something that we can perceive with our eyes. So it's interesting, we can hear higher sounds with our eyes than we can with our ears. And the intrigue comes in the form that there is an organ in your body that actually can perceive low frequencies and higher frequencies than light. And that's in the NIH documents. And it is the piezoelectric properties of your pineal gland. The pineal gland, for all intensive purposes, from what science has discovered thus far, has rods and cones just like the eyes. But it also has the shape and it has the process, and when it is not calcified, of having a liquid crystal piezoelectric process in which when it vibrates, it releases a voltage. And what's interesting about that is when we start to get into that thought process, then we realize that as something would vibrate your pineal gland, you are actually experiencing the subtle frequencies of the cycles of the universe, or the harmony of the spheres, or the song of the planets, depending on who you ask. Pythagoras says the spheres, the planets, they actually are in harmony with each other. Mathematically, as I do the math, they seem to calculate out to fifths and thirds, right? And then Tesla comes along and says, hey man, I was in some weird sort of trance, and I built a machine that was designed to receive subtle frequencies, and all of a sudden I'm looking through a telescope and I have my thing vibrating over here telling me a frequency is coming through and it's in movement with the planet. The planet was singing to me, and everybody thinks he's crazy. But truth be told is that these cycles are actually Hertzian. They are actually making a sound you can't hear, but that you can perceive with a part of your body that is so subtle that the only thing that we really have perceived that it can control is your sleep. Now that gets deep, because the truth be told is the only thing that ever actually governs the voice of prophecy seems to be the times between when you were asleep and awake, which means as you're falling asleep, that voice can be heard, and then once you're asleep, it can't be heard. And as you are waking up, that voice can be heard, and once you're awake, it can't be heard. Unless you have stayed in a state in which you are able to perceive it, which is a theta state. Guess when else you can drop into that state? Meditation. So don't give me the hogwash that you're praying for somebody if you are speaking words and thinking about it. Because the truth be told is that true prayer actually is in that tranced state, in which you will utter things that you don't really understand. But I'm just going to share with you, I'm going to tell you what that's not. That is not that ecstatic speech that the charismatic world believes is the only proof of your salvation. What it is when you actually get quiet and the subtle self actually speaks. When we speak of the subtle body, we're talking about intuition. When we speak of the subtle body, we're talking about the part of you that is Yahweh, the part of you that's dumbing down from the 750,000 volts down to the 1.5 volts that could charge a phone, right? We don't plug a phone into the high tension, high voltage lines, because why? Not only would explode, but so would we the moment we plug in. We would just cease to have an ability to stay together at the cellular level. That's how powerful 750,000 volts is at the amps that it is. You just stop having the ability to be a composite. You don't maintain composition. Okay. So the reason why this is so important is because now when we start to get into the subtleties of the Sabbath, we understand that the Sabbath itself requires us to respond to it in such a way that has nothing to do with our conscious mind. You see, one of the reasons why there is a commandment for the Mikra is because there's supposed to be a Hebrew speaking of Torah. Now, I could tell you, our services serve a very specific purpose. And I can tell you that there's a part of me who believes that if I did a live on Monday morning, you would not watch it. And you might watch it later on, but one of the benefits of the live in the moment is obviously the connection, because there's a corporate collective conscience actually intentionally watching at this moment. And that means that there's an influence upon each other with our thoughts and our frequencies that is kind of synchronistic, or better yet, synergistic. Okay. Now, what this means is that I don't actually sit there and read Torah. Now, when we had a Torah scroll camera and we were doing the parashas, and we actually had the camera on the scroll, and I would show you those Hebrew words, that's the equivalent of that. Even if you don't know the language, we're speaking the language or showing you the language of your Creator. Now, again, obviously, those are Aramaic versions of the letters, but the point behind it is still the same. There is an intention and a vibration that is being communicated that you're not going to communicate in the Proto-Indo-European languages. Because those are the languages of the nations, and Yahweh didn't choose the languages of the nations. He chose the language of Hebrew to create his universe. And in fact, however we connect it up, we will have the simplicity of the fact that until we return to that language universally and abandon the Aramaic pronunciations and abandon the Aramaic lettering and return to the stories of the letters to understand the mechanism behind the Hebrew word, which will always be a verb, which means it'll always be an action. To change your status from unclean to clean, you have to wash with water. That's an action of Tomei. Okay? Until we do that, we will not have the understanding that we would have when we are all connected into that process. The understanding of the relationship between us and the Creator, between us, and between us and the things that are under us. Okay? Now, the way that I want you to think about this is that if you have gone through Sabbath, there are three very important points. And I can tell you, some of you are going to go, oh, I'll bet you that was a confirmation for his message when I had that conversation with him this week. Number one, if you are causing yourself to experience the chemical reactions that would create resentment behind the subtleties of Sabbath, then you are not doing it right. If you go into preparation for the Sabbath experiencing stress, you are not keeping the Sabbath. If you go into the Sabbath stressed, you are not keeping the Sabbath. You go into the Sabbath turning off, disassociating, stepping into a trance that you will not wake up from until sundown Saturday night. stepping into a trance that disassociates you from the things that should be stressing you out on the Sabbath. If you go into the Sabbath conscientiously praying, go into the Sabbath conscientiously saying words, conscientiously lighting candles, conscientiously eating food, conscientiously driving to wherever you're going, and then conscientiously sitting in a pew and conscientiously saying Hebrew prayers or conscientiously singing English songs about the misinterpretations of theology, you're not keeping the Sabbath. You're not guarding the Sabbath. In fact, here's a crazy one. Yahweh said to call Sabbath a delight. Do you know that your pleasure sensors and all of your reward chemicals are probably out of whack when you arrive at the Sabbath? You have done all kinds of stuff to mess up your biorhythms and to mess up your mechanisms in such a way that you approach the Sabbath the way you approach every day, except that you don't have to work, which really kind of is more like a day off. That's not what Sabbath is. Sabbath is not a day off. The Sabbath is actually a rest from your power as an Elohim. And why? Because you need to replenish. You need to be the balloon that receives and expands so that it can wash right back down the system into whoever needs it during the week. As a melech, someone who walks among the people. What's interesting is the word lach, which is what? Not tame for the yoke. That was the opposite. Remember that from last week? But instead, staff in hand. In other words, I'm going to conform to the authority to become the authority, actually has water in its word. Meaning what? It flows out equally in every direction, paths of least resistance. That's what a king is. A king spreads his wealth, spreads his energy, spreads the energy of the universe equally in all directions, following the path of least resistance. Remember, Yeshua said, if you go into a town and you put out your shalom and your shalom is not received, let it return to you, dust your feet off, and move on. That's path of least resistance. But a king doing that in that way is obviously something that requires him to replenish that water. Furthermore, the water that's distributed is not dissipated, right? There needs to be a necessity to return and push more water out, because why? That water is going to evaporate. That water is going to dissipate. And so ensuring that it is not dissipated means you walk among them again. Who is them? Well, let's propose that it's not the ones who understand that the Aleph and the Resh is not a photon emission, right? So what is the actual point here? What is the key? Theta is the only way you can truly receive Shabbat. Now, like I said, our ministry is unique in the fact that we actually need to teach you on a day when you take the day off. And I'm going to tell you that if you're a Sabbath keeper, you probably do regular activities on Sunday. I know we hit the ground running with our businesses and our work and our stuff on Sunday. We may recreate a little bit, but truth be told, that is one of our work days. In fact, for our businesses, we are open for business on Sunday morning. So it's interesting because in all of that process, then you could agree that there needs to be a reading out loud of the Hebrew Torah during the Shabbat. But that's not what this system right here is designed to do. This is designed to fix your brain. The whole point behind what we're doing in After His Heart Ministries is capturing you as an audience in a corporate collective agreement of listening and watching with us on this day for the purpose of getting into the nuances of the Torah. I would love to say broadcast on Wednesday morning, right? Broadcast on the day when I don't have a whole lot of business. Broadcast on the day when I can actually sit down, do a recording, do the editing, do everything I need to do to make this presentable for you, cut it up into chunks so you don't get bored. But in that all that process, recall that what I want is for people to do that corporately because of the energy behind it. So Shabbat is the appropriate day for this. But that doesn't mean that we are necessarily keeping Shabbat. Because why? You're consciously processing this right now. Now, what you're not consciously processing is the only thing that's actually going to take with you. And that's where I've repeated things over and over and over again to get your brain to disengage so that I can speak to your subconscious. But in that process and in the mechanism of that reality, I think it's really important that as we work with the system and the subtleties of the Shabbat, you will notice something different about your life, about your reality. You need to stop taking your day off, like Wednesday, and trying to make it a Shabbat. You can't. You can't do that. And the reason you can't is because the rest of the universe is on a cycle, on a mechanism, on a process. A process in which even the manna was obedient to the day. It refused to fall on that day. And the manna doubled up on the sixth day to cover for the seventh, so that you would not be what? Consciously preparing. But you would be already prepared, and you could just move into the day and its subtleness. If we got into the nuances of restraining your foot from the Sabbath, if we got into the nuances of the Shalom Aleichem, if we got into the nuances of the beliefs concerning the fourth commandment, if we got into the nuances of the one thing that is apparent within all of everything that has happened in the nations versus the nation of Israel, is that the system of the feast days has been obliterated. And one of those feast days being Shabbat. Leviticus chapter 23, verse 2 says, or verse 1 says, these are the feast days of Yahweh, and starts with the Shabbat. 6 days you shall work, and the seventh you shall rest. On that day you have a holy mikra, right? A holy convocation. And you will do no what? Avodah, and you will do no malakah. You will do no servile work. You will do no business negotiation. Which makes the subtlety of Shabbat absolutely a secret that only the adept can tap into. Only those who know this secret, that there's a mechanism in their mind able to hear the sound of the Sabbath and activate within the mind a stimulus to guide into higher learning, then we can perceive something very important out of the entire thing. And that is that there is, within the confines of the reality of Sabbath, learning. If there was ever a day when you want to consume knowledge in such a way that you would retain it, this is that day. Now, I would not recommend studying things that would make you money, because that can very quickly get you thinking about the things you're supposed to let go of. But this is a good day. I can tell you, all the martial arts that I know right now, I trained on the Sabbath because that was the only day available to do it. And there was a lot I didn't understand about the Sabbath back then, but I can tell you, because it was so subtle and because it was so powerful, what I was supposed to learn over a 12-month period, I learned in 4 months times 18. So there were 18 pieces of the system that I needed to learn, and each one of those was supposed to take 1 year. And so 18 years later, I would have known the whole system. I learned it in 4 months. And the reason I did is because it was on the Shabbat. because your mind is geared towards learning on the Shabbat. Now, in addition to this, there is one last very important thing, and that is that if you understand what I'm saying to you, you will realize that the Sabbath actually has a voice. And if the Sabbath actually has a voice, then I suppose we should better understand voice. And that is going to be a message for another time. If you like what you've heard, you can comment and you can say, hey, you know what? I don't understand this part. I will answer you and help you understand. If you are in any way, shape, or form more interested in the ministry, there's contact information. But the biggest and most important thing is that you start to change your thinking. We're already past the point of proving to you that the seventh day is the day of rest. I'm already past the point of proving to you that the seventh day is actually not settling, but is full of action and activity. And I am past the point now of proving to you that it actually makes a sound. So if you really start to get your mind wrapped around the idea that your conscious choices are not really what actually actions the spiritual reality that we experience, then you have moved to another level of understanding. And in that way,